about clearance, and then we will mainly, okay, what is basically clearance. So for that, I have taken a picture from the General Safety Guide 18 from the IAEA. Okay, and we see that clearance is about the sources and practices that are amenable to control, especially more precisely for planet exposure situations. And so if we look at what is under regulatory control, we see that basically exemption dictates what comes into regulatory control, while on the other hand, clearance is about what is what can be removed basically from this control. Okay. IAEA gives a set of criteria for clearances, and we will see later for Europe and for Belgium that we are very close to that. So these criteria, it's basically saying that the risk must be sufficiently low, the radiation risk. So that means that it should be in the order of 10 microsievert per year. We should be under that value. And IAEA also considers what they call low probability scenarios, for which the criteria is under 1 millisievert per year. Okay. Also, we can say or that we can clear something is if there is no net benefit in continuing this regulatory control. So keeping these sources or material under the regulatory control. So next, we can ask ourselves the question: what can be clear? What can be cleared? And the answer is for IAEA that clearance does apply to objects, materials. So that includes radioactive waste, any physical form. So we can talk about solids, liquids, and gases. Even though for liquid and gases we should not, well, we should still make the distinction between clearance and what we call release. That is another thing very close to it, but there are also some differences. Clearance also does apply to buildings, part of buildings, and does not apply to specific things like the site release. That is something else, but also some very specific things like foodstuff, drinking water, animal food, etc. Okay. So these are the main documents. If you want to look, if you want to go deeper into the IAEA position on clearance, so of course the safety requirement, the GSR, and also we have the two safety guides. The GSG 17 and 18, 18 being the one about clearance, and 17 about exemption. These two replaced the previous RSG 1.7 that was about clearance, exemption, and exclusion. Okay. So, okay, we, as Federica introduced, clearance is a very important part of circular economy, waste and waste minimization. Okay, most of the waste volume falls into the very low to low activity categories, and so clearance is clearly a big part of a possible solution to the waste problem. Okay, I've taken here an example taken from the Nuclear Waste Management Commission in Germany, the ESK, which shows, so this graph shows the approximate total mass waste from the control area from a German nuclear power plant. And we see that clearly the vast majority, or more than 95% of the mass falls under clearance, unrestricted and restricted clearance. So this is clearly one of the big solution to the waste problem. Now, of course, I am here to talk about the national regulation here in Belgium, and in order to understand that, we just need to introduce a little bit how we get to that, and for that we need to look at the European level. So we will see later that most of the regulation about clearance here in Belgium is based on the legislation text that we call the ARBIS, the RGPRI. And this text was originally based on the Basic Safety Standard from 96. Okay, the Council Directive 96/29 Euratom. Okay. This text has been since changed. We're now working with the Basic Safety Standard from 2013, and this is the one on which our current legislation, regulation, the current RGPRI, ARBIS, is based. And this is quite an important thing, because between these two, there were some big differences about clearance. To illustrate that, I've taken the BSS recital 37, which states that there is a benefit in having the same activity concentration value both for exemption and for clearance. So both for exemption of practices and the clearance of materials. This is based on the RSJ 1.7 from IAEA, which is different from the initial basic safety standard, which was based on the radiation protection 122. So mainly this means that the clearance level for generic clearance that we now have is based on a different document that was initially based. Okay. Now, the BSS still leave a great deal of discretion to the member state. There is this subsidiarity principle, okay, and so of course this is important for an harmonization point of view. We could say that the regulation is quite well harmonized, at least for the Belgian point of view, and the reason is that it is based on a lot of guidance and text that were later published, and I've taken here some examples. So we have, of course, the RP 122 that I talked just on the previous slide, but also some others for specific types of materials, for example, the EC 89 or 113. There were also two important documents that I want to point here, which is the RP 134 about the evaluation of the application of the concept of exemption and clearance for practices in the EU member states, and also this very important of the RP 157, which did the comparative study between what we find as clearance levels in the RSJ 1.7 from IAEA and this previous document that we were using, which is the RP 122. And yeah, this is really the base document which allow the use of the new clearance levels that were taken in the BSS from 2013. I should say that overall, we see many similarities between the RP 122 and the RSJ 1.7. Okay, the reason was that most of the scenarios were very close. The whole approach was also quite similar, with enveloping scenarios and same exposure pathways. Also, the fact that they based the values on the biggest dose contributor for each reference individual. So, and also the fact that there is also always this rule to cap, most of the time, to cap the clearance levels by the exemption levels, which is very logical, because you don't want to take something out of regulatory control with clearance levels to put it right back in right after, because you would be above the exemption level. That would have no sense. So this is a common rule that both texts were using. So overall, the conclusion of this study was that both documents were giving clearance levels that were very close, not always exactly the same values, but within a range of 10 to 100, and for most radionuclides it was a factor of 10. So yeah, the two texts were very close, and the regulations, the clearance level were very close. Okay. RP 122 being a little bit more conservative than the RST 1.7. Okay, now that this has been seen, we can jump right into the Belgian legislation and talk about the regulatory framework for clearance in Belgium. So I list here the main documents if you really want to dig into Belgian legislation. So as I said, the Royal Decree of 20 July of 2001 is what we call the ARBIS, the RGPRI, depending on how you say that in Dutch or French, and which has been modified according to the new BSS, so which has been modified by the Royal Decree, also of 20 July, but 2020. Okay. Aside from that, we have some FANC decrees. So FANC is the Federal Agency for Nuclear Control. So we have mainly two important here decrees related to clearance that I will talk in a bit more detail later on. The first one being the one from the 30th of April 2010, which is the decree laying down guidelines on how you measure basically and what is the methodology and techniques that the licensee should show to demonstrate compliance with the clearance levels, and also a more recent one, which is the one from 16 August 2021, which is the technical regulation setting surface clearance levels for different types of materials, buildings, metals, or other types of materials. Okay, then yeah, there are some other texts that are a bit less important, or for example, the Royal Decree of 30/11/11, the ARPSIN, which is important for the dismantling of big nuclear installation, and we know that clearance is quite related to decommissioning also. So these are useful texts as well, but the main ones are listed above. I also want to talk about some FANC nota, some position papers that are important for clearance. There is one about the conditions for the release of solid radioactive waste for disposal in waste landfill. There is another one for the clearance of building. Okay, I should also point out that there are some notes are currently being developed but not yet published about metal melting and recycling of concrete. Now, I need to go a little bit more in detail with the RGPRI, ARBIS. Okay, just so that you don't need to read the whole thing because it talks about a lot of things, but specifically for clearance, these are the important articles that I need to discuss and that are about clearance. The first one that I wanted to point is the Article 23. This one lists, among other things, it lists the tasks of the radiation protection expert within the health physics department, the HPD. And in this Article 23, we will see that the RPE has to review and approve clearance projects, and that includes also the procedure, characterization, procedure clearance procedures for verifying compliance with the clearance levels if it has not already been done for a similar type of waste. Okay. Of course, this article also says other things. It also lists the mission of the RPO, which is also an important function, because this is the guy that will make sure that the procedures are well followed inside the control area, and especially for everything that relates to the characterization and measurement of activity. He's the one that makes sure that things are done properly in the controlled area, and that these procedures established by the RPE are well followed by the workers. It doesn't mean that necessarily that the RPO has to make the measurement themselves. Okay, these measurements for clearance can be done by other people, but the RPO has to make sure that these measurements are done correctly according to the procedures. Article 23 also talks about the supervision of the HPD, which, if we related that to Article 38, basically explains the role of FANG and Bellevue towards clearance. And now we'll talk a bit more about that later. And then we jump to the waste part, and first I talk about Article 33, which is about the minimization principle, which reaffirms the importance of clearance, reuse, and recycling for radioactive substances, which is basically the common pyramid for waste, and the fact that we want to, as much as possible, we want to avoid producing new waste. Okay. I know very well that 18 comes before 23, but I think it's really more specific without any playing with the words. So specific clearance, also what we call conditional clearance, this one is discussed in Article 18, and of course we will talk a lot about this in the later slides. Back to the waste part. Article 35 is about the collection, treatment, and removal of solid waste, while Article 34 is about liquid waste. So for the 35, this is where the ARBIS RGPD will point towards the clearance levels for generic clearance, so that are mentioned, that are published in the Appendix 1B of the RGPD. If you cannot comply with these, then of course it will relate to Article 18 with the conditional clearance, which needs a license and authorization from the FANG. Then Article 35 also talks about the clearance of short-lived radionuclide waste. So by short-lived, we should define that. So here we talk about short-lived when the half-life is under 6 months. And so basically, in our Belgian legislation, it means that if your waste contains, if it's only made of short-lived radionuclides, you need a near complete decay. That means at least waiting 10 half-lives in order to be able to clear the waste. Then, of course, no deliberate dilution. This is always important. And it also talks about the annual inventory of cleared waste. So every year, the licensee has to send the complete inventory of the cleared waste for solids. And yeah. Then there is also the Article 34 about liquid waste. So as I said, one should not be confused between the difference between release and clearance. So specifically, the clearance of liquids is something that we will use for chemically charged liquids, like, for example, oils or cooling agents, things like that. Okay, organic liquids, because these cannot be discharged in sewers or surface water. Okay, so in this case, you should go. You should use the Article 18. Okay, but so with a FANG authorization, but there are some exemption for that. Mainly the fact that you can clear without this Article 18 authorization if you comply with specific conditions, which is that the treatment method of these liquids must be identical to what would apply to solid waste, and you need to comply with clearance levels, with the generic clearance levels of Appendix 1B, and also the quantity must be less than 1 ton. So if you comply with that, you don't need an Article 18 authorization for specific clearance. So it's easier, and in this case, you basically fall back. I mean, it will be treated very much like a solid waste. You will have to keep to include that in the inventory of the annual inventory of waste, and also, for example, if it's made of short-lived radionuclides, then you need also to wait for near complete decay. That being said, there is also one nice thing, which is that if you are in this case with short-lived radionuclide, then the additional condition of being under 1 ton does not apply. Okay. I should say that a clearance of gas is something that is considered in the GSG 18 from IAEA, but it is not discussed in the Belgian legislation. Okay. That being said, it's not a case that we often meet again. Now, I want to talk a bit more about these two appendices, the 1A and the 1B. So this is where you will find the famous exemption levels and clearance levels. Okay, so of course for both of these, we're talking about levels that are nuclide specific. Okay, they are expressed in becquerel, in kilobecquerel per kilogram, becquerel per gram. That's the same, and they are in both cases, as we discussed previously, based on the directive of uranium from the BSS from 2013. Exemption levels do apply for moderate quantities, so under 1 ton. Otherwise, you will base your exemption levels on the clearance level from Annex 1B. I should say also that exemption levels applies to the total amount of radioactive substances held by the entity, while the clearance levels, they do apply on the waste. And this is something quite also interesting, is that currently in the RGPD, ARBIS consider clearance only for waste. And also in the FANG decree, this is currently the case. Now, I should point out that there are some updating work in progress, and the FANG decree of 30 April 2010 is about, I mean, should be very soon updated. And in this update, one of the main ideas is the fact that we will enlarge the scope of clearance to also objects and materials. Also, I should point, of course, that both levels are based on a 10 microsievert per year criterion. Now, that doesn't mean that the levels are, of course, the same, because the way that you calculate the scenarios and the way that you arrive to these criteria are not the same. Okay, so you will end up with different levels, but the criterion behind it is the same. Also, it was studied that you cannot really make a direct relation between exemption levels and clearance levels. Now, of course, clearance level in general are under exemption levels for the reason that we mentioned before, but we can see that there is quite a variety of factors between these two. It can range from 1 to 1,000, and you cannot really use some sort of common factor between these two, because if you would do that For some nuclides, you would be way too restrictive, and for other nuclides, you would end up with impact with a dose impact that is way above 10 microsieverts. So you really have to deal with two sets of levels. Then we go to our two main FANG decrees. So the first one, I just talked a little bit about this one, the FANG decree from 30th of April 2010. So as I said, it should be very soon updated. So this one is about laying down guidelines on measurement procedures and techniques, okay, to comply, to demonstrate compliance with the clearance levels. It talks about what? It talks about the methodology, the scope, clearance procedure, what we call the certificate of origin, the measurement procedures, roles, responsibilities, and also everything related to reporting. Okay. The FANG decree of 16 August 2021, this one is very important because this is where you will find the surface clearance levels that do apply to various types of materials, the metal, non-metal, buildings, part of building for reuse or for destruction. So yeah, it's really quite a multiple sets of clearance levels that can be used by the licensee depending on what they're dealing with. Should also point out that in this technical regulation, you also find generic surface clearance levels, which are well based on the infamous 0.4 and 0.04 becquerel per square centimeter, based on if you're dealing with beta gamma emitters or low toxicity alpha emitters, and on the other hand with the other alpha emitters. Now these we were used to these because of the transport regulation. Of course, we have many times seen that these levels in the transport regulation should not be, I mean, are not meant to be used for clearance. But that being said, we found out that these values are perfectly adapted to clearance in our case, but because they are generic, they are quite low, and most of the time licenses are better to use the nuclide-specific clearance, surface clearance levels, because most of the time it will be, I mean, the levels being higher, it will be easier to comply with these. This text also states the maximum surface on which you can average the contamination, the surface activity, which is also an important thing because if you increase the size of your measuring unit, of course it can have an impact on it can make the demonstration of compliance easier. So it's important to also being prescriptive about this value. So I will accelerate a little bit. So the idea is to, now that we have seen what we find in the Belgian legislation, we can see that we can safely say that we comply with the responsibilities of what we ask for a regulatory body. So, of course, one of the first things is to establish the framework and the requirement. And as we've seen, this is exactly what we do. We do establish the regulatory framework for both clearance and conditional clearance with the ARBIS RGPRI. We define the radiological characterization requirement to verify compliance with these radiation protection requirements. This is mainly done through the FANG decree of 30 April 2010. We do specify the content of essential records and documentation. This is also in the very same text, and we ensure that cleared sources do not become again subject to licensing or notification, okay? Because of the comparison between clearance levels and exemption levels. Oversight of monitoring and verification, review and approve monitoring and measuring programs. This is also what we do. We do ensure the capability to perform independent verification measurements as a Belvie, as a TSO, as the capability, the trained people, and the right measuring devices to perform such independent verification. So we do sometimes make inspection where we sample cleared materials, cleared waste, and verify that they to comply with the clearance level. So that includes things like surface contamination meters, but also more complex devices like gamma spectrometry and ISACs. And then finally, education and competence. Of course, we make sure as a regulatory body as a whole to establish requirements for the education and training of the individuals responsible for the clearance activities. Of course, in the FANC decree of 30 of April 2010, it is clear to state that that the individual performing these measurements must be trained, and they have a kind of habilitation given by the health physics department, by the RPA, to do such a work. Okay. One should insist on the key objective of the regulatory body, which is ensuring a safe, transparent, and consistent clearance process, guaranteeing, demonstrating that once the materials are removed from regulatory control, that they do not longer pose any radiological risk. This is really the key objective here. Now, the responsibilities of the licensees, of course, responsibilities towards characterization, towards following the procedures, quality, and reliability about their demonstration for compliance, the organization, making sure that the organization structure, the training are sufficient and allow for clearance, for a reliable clearance. The recording, of course, so that's documenting the clearance with the clearance files, and also the inventory that is sent to the FANC. And of course, the approval, because every single clearance has to be approved by the RPE from the health physics department. This is also to compare with their needs, the needs of the licensees. They want simplicity, they want flexibility, they want robustness, efficiency, reliability. They also want traceability. So all these things should increase, while the fraction of waste, the dose to workers, and of course the cost should be as small as possible. Now, of course, we can immediately see that it is not an easy task, because some of these objectives are sometimes a bit contradictory, or at least hard to match together. It's hard to have something simple and at the same time robust, and that is flexible and efficient. So yeah, it's not always easy, and this is really what they're trying to do. Now we go to the derivation to the derivation of generic clearance levels. So as we discussed a little bit, so if we go from the right to the left, just to explain, so our Belgian appendices 1A and 1B that I previously presented, so as we said, are based on the Euratom PSS, which based on the RP 157 can be based itself on the RSG 1.7. That is itself that itself takes the activity levels, the clearance levels that were calculated by the safety in the safety report 44. So safety report 44 is the IAA document that explains basically the methodology for the calculation of these scenarios, and the different exposure pathways that are considered, and where they do the whole calculation. It's interesting to see that their approach in SR44 is to consider two kinds of scenarios. They look at that what they call like realistic scenarios. So they take it's a little bit conservative, but still all the parameters for the scenarios are quite realistic. And in this case, they aim for a dose criterion of 10 microsievert per year. So this is really the main criteria that we use for clearance. That being said, they also look at what they call low probability scenarios. So basically, this means that they, for the same scenarios, they take very conservative values for all the parameters, and so in this case, of course, you will end up with levels that are way more strict if you would apply the same dose criterion. But in this case, the dose criterion is different and is based on the 1 millisievert per year. So yeah, they take these two different approaches and take the most restrictive levels from these two cases. And of course, the idea of enveloping scenarios is to make sure that any reasonable, conceivable exposure situation will not yield doses that would be higher than what the enveloping scenarios are considering. Okay. These generic clearance levels, they do cover many types of materials, so metals, non-metals, rubble, building, etc. So that's the whole point of using generic clearance levels. As I said, it in general should be below exemption levels. And I also wanted to point out the rounding procedure because I think it's really interesting now, and we will discuss a little bit later about uncertainties. And I think it's quite interesting also to understand that it's not, I mean, there's a good reason for why all these clearance levels are power of 10. Of course, there is a rounding procedure, and actually how the rounding procedure works, well, it's basically they just say that, okay, let's say you have the value of 0.5. Well, 0.5, should you round it to 0.1 or to 1? Well, if you round it to 1, that would be that you multiply it by 2. But if you round it to the bottom value, that would mean that you divide it by 5. So it's a bit odd, and so the rounding procedure that they use takes that into account. Basically, the idea is that for every value that is between 0.3 and 3, you would say that this would have a clearance level of 1 becquerel per gram. And then, for example, if you're between 3 and 30, that would be 10, etc. Okay, so we understand that with such a rounding procedure, that would mean that in theory, one clearance level could, in the worst case scenario, that could lead to a dose not of 10 but of 30 microsievert per year. Okay. And yeah, I think that is very important because we'll see later that for the uncertainty management, sometimes we try to really like cut hairs in four, and one should not forget that these rounding procedure introduce a quite large amount of uncertainty already. Okay. Should also be interesting to see that okay, we based our values in Belgium on these BSS, but it's not exactly the values of the BSS. For some nuclides, we can still see some differences. Some values were kept from the RP 122 from the previous reference document. We can list, for example, radium 226. I think our value is 0.01 becquerel per gram, while in the BSS they suggest the value of 1. So we see that there are still some differences. Okay. And all these, I mean, all these levels were derived, as I said, based on enveloping scenarios. These are the scenarios that are considered in the safety report 44. And okay, we won't dig too much into detail, but I just want to point out that we see that there are different kind of scenarios with different exposed individuals as a reference individual. And also we see that for each scenario, there are different exposure pathways. So of course, we would sum all the contribution from these different exposure pathway for each scenario. I think it's also interesting to look a little bit on what is done outside, and for example on the other side of the Atlantic. So I took this example taken from the U.S. NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, from the United States, in the 10 CFR 2014-02, the radiological criteria for unrestricted use. And I think it's really interesting to see that in this regulation, they consider for a site that would be considered as acceptable for unrestricted use if they can demonstrate that they do comply with a dose criterion, not of 10 microsievert, but of 250 microsievert, so 25 millirem. And so that includes a very similar exposure pathway, so this is the dose criterion that they use. They also state that it must be, of course, ALARA. We immediately understand that this is a huge gap, and this has a big implication, of course, because if you base all your dose criterion on 10 or on 250, you can imagine the difference that it gives in terms of volume of waste that you can consider for unrestricted use. Then I would like to talk a little bit about the graded approach. The graded approach is very important for clearance. This is something, of course, that we do apply in our legislation here in Belgium. Just making sure that the degree of implementation matches the risk of activation and contamination. It's just using basic pragmatism. And we will see that in our regulation. For example, as we said in the fact degree of 30th of April 2010, we do exclude non-waste objects or short-lived waste. Short-lived waste is a good example. Okay, because of the near complete decay, of course, we don't need to apply such a high level of characterization procedure and documentation with clearance files and etc. We can do things a bit simpler, and that is very understandable. Also, for example, the minimum number of measurements can be different in that case. I will talk a bit more about that later. Also, for the surface clearance levels, well, this is a good example of graded approach, because basically the fact that you use different sets of clearance levels for different types of materials is basically a graded approach by itself. Now, talking about graded approach, I think it's also interesting to mention that the clearance is not necessarily applied everywhere, and France is a well-known example for that. So as a lot of you probably know, in France, there is another approach. They don't use generic clearance for very low activity waste, TFA waste. But still, there are many projects and reflection about how to, about valorization of a TFA waste. And I mentioned this French decree that goes in that direction. They go more for segregation mechanism with what they call a zonage déchet, waste zonage, with different types of area. So the whole idea is basically to differentiate waste not on their activity, but on their origin. Okay. Of course, this different approach has its own advantages and disadvantages. It's robust, it's easy to trace, but on the other hand, we know that it can be challenging for example, the capacity of the storage. The good example being Sires, which is the the one in this case that that has a finite volume for waste, and France very well known that they can there is a risk of exceeding that value, and so there are projects to enlarge this volume, this capacity. Now, specific clearance. So we know that specific, that is basically saying conditional. These are two different words for the same things. Conditional, that means putting conditions on the type of materials, putting conditions on the amount of materials, on the destination, on the methodology. For example, how many transport per driver per year can you do while doing specific clearance? Okay, you can put conditions on that. Okay. It's of course a sustainable approach, because the main advantage is that because you are considering very specific scenarios, that this will allow you to derive higher clearance levels, and so you will increase the fraction of waste that can be put back into circular economy. It allows for more reuse and recycling. Now, it's interesting also to talk about the transborder case. If you want to do specific clearance internationally, of course, you need always to take into consideration the clearance levels that are applied in the other state. Okay, so there should be some kind of arrangement between the two countries, the regulatory body of the two countries, to make sure that such a clearance, that such a specific clearance project is sound. Also, it's interesting to discuss, okay, when exactly is the waste cleared when you're doing specific clearance? And in fact, it's a two-stage process, because at the first stage, the licensee demonstrate that the waste complies with the specific clearance levels. There are agreements with the for example, the destination organization. So everything is okay, but the waste is still on the licensee side. So the next stage, of course, is when the waste has been transferred to the destination organization, and that proper documentation and proofs are available that indeed the waste has met all the additional conditions that were in the authorization delivered by the FAC. So, this is what we do here in Belgium. So the specific clearance is mentioned is our RGPD Article 35 that links to the Article 18. Also, this Article 35 links to the technical regulation for surface clearance levels, which is a kind of specific condition, specific clearance, because as I said, these surface clearance levels are we have multiple sets based on type of materials and etc. So these are, of course, a conditional clearance. You need to comply with your material needs to be in that scope in order to apply such a level. And of course, also the FANC decree of the 30th of April 2010 is also applicable for specific clearance. So it is applicable for generic clearance level and conditional clearance levels. So the way you will demonstrate.
Excuse me,
yep.
Lionel, I just want to tell you that you have just 5 minutes.
Yeah, that is fine.
Okay.
That is fine. Okay, so this is and how we derive a clearance level, and I will just jump to the next slide. So how do we apply that? So for the derivation of the specific clearance levels here in Belgium, it is done via an impact study where the licensee can choose the units and demonstrate how they comply with these. the methodology is basically to use the same exposure pathways as generic clearance levels, but just adapt the parameters to the specific destination of the waste to prove that they're complying with the dose criterion. And here I just mentioned this NOTA that is specific for the landfills. Okay. For the process of clearance here in Belgium, so this is how we proceed. So the first thing that we ask is, okay, do we have a clearance procedure? Does the licensee has a clearance procedure? If not, it must be established and approved by the health physics department and by Belvie. If there is already one, then they can start using it. That means establishing the certificate of origin that contains information about physical, chemical properties, the history of the waste, the isotopic vector, maybe some measurement that were already done that were not clearance measurement, but that are still useful. Okay, and so based on that, they do this certificate of origin. They put the measurements in place, verify that they are under clearance level, and then they establish the clearance file. This one will be approved by the health physics department. And if it's the very first one of this type of waste, then Belvie will also has to approve. Okay. Otherwise, it is by default cleared after authorization, after approval by the health physics department, and then after storage on site, it will be evacuated. And of course, the inventory needs to be adapted. Okay. So about defining the material and contaminants, we know that these are very important steps. I've listed some examples, some reasons why it's very important that the clearance procedure and clearance file clearly go much into the detail for why which type of material you're dealing with, which type of contaminant. All these things are very important to decide how you would treat the waste. Okay. About the characterization, sampling, and measurement techniques. So there are some good practices that we do apply here in Belgium, I think. We have this principle of 2 independent measurements for clearance. So we can have 2 different operators doing the same kind of method for characterization, or we can have 2 different independent methods done by the same operator. Okay. This is something that we want to put in place to increase reliability of the result. Now, there are some cases where you can not do that, but most of the time, this is what we do. There is a new background that is taken every day. We define maximum averaging size, like 1 ton, 1 cubic meter, 1 ton, and 1 square meter for surface, and the result must always be converted in activity units. That is also important. We want to really be able to compare it with the clearance levels. Okay. About sampling, this is also something that is more and more done. We see an increased usage of sampling here in Belgium, and it's not always easy to. It's quite challenging also for us, because the demonstration of compliance is not immediate, because you only measure a fraction of the whole waste. So where do you sample? What is the size of sample? How many samples? All these things are more and more questions that we face in our day-to-day work as a regulatory body. About decision making, the sum rule. It's quite funny because this sum rule uses values that are basically never known, because these are the real values, and of course you can only make measurements with a finite accuracy. And the problem is that uncertainties for clearance levels are quite similar in size compared with the clearance levels, because these clearance levels are very low. So it's not. This is the evaluating of uncertainties is something that you have to do when you're dealing with clearance, and this is clearly something that is not easy. Okay. And there are many reasons for these uncertainties: nuclear accounting, sampling, etc., etc. So in our regulation, we take that into account. We ask. So there are some simplification that can be done. The licensees can reduce. They can disregard some radionuclides based on the 99% rule in the SUN rule. They can neglect natural isotopes in some cases, and they have to use this ISO norm about the characteristic limits like decision threshold, detection limits, and confidence interval. The basic rule being that the detection limit must always be lower than the clearance level. It's basically saying that your measurement procedure must be accurate enough to demonstrate that you're complying with the clearance levels. Okay. And I just want to conclude with a couple of slides here. So IAEA GSG 18 says, okay, we should, when considering the clearance of materials, the upper confidence level of the measurement result should take into account all the significant sources of uncertainty and should be below the clearance levels. That is nice, but at the same time, they insist that, okay, noting the overall conservatism inherent in clearance levels, and we've talked about the rounding procedures and all these things, care should be taken not to introduce significant additional conservatism through this mechanism. Okay. In the Belgian regulation, we try to not be overly prescriptive in that regard. There are no particular rules on false negative risk or dealing with samplings. The licensees are quite free to propose, and then we have to challenge them as a regulatory body to make sure that we are compliant with the clearance levels. I've talked about recording, so I won't go too much into the details, just that every clearance files recording are kept for 30 years by the licensee or are transferred to the FANC after termination of their authorization. And that's basically it. So as a conclusion, well, we're close to an harmonized situation, but we're not there yet. The clearance levels are not exactly the same everywhere. I talk about radium-226. We can talk about cesium, for example, in the UK. So we still see some small differences, but important one. Because, for example, cesium is an important radionuclide. More importantly, specific clearance levels are closely related to the solutions available in the country, which translates into even more differences. So even if we have the same levels and the same regulation, we would still have differences between, because with the same dose criterion, if the destination solutions are different, then you will end up with different operational clearance levels that are different, even though the dose impact should be the same, and that still leads to differences between the countries. And the only way, basically, to avoid that would be to be able to exchange waste between the borders. But yeah, that's not a topic. The risk appetite isn't formally prescribed in the regulation, but it's still important for trust. For public trust and trust between the countries and the regulatory bodies. The risk is about managing uncertainties, but to which extent is it needed, considering all the conservatism that we have discussed? And the regulation changes can help bringing a top-to-bottom harmonization, but maybe we would benefit also from promoting a bottom-to-top harmonization. And this is what we, of course, are doing as well, but maybe we should even more promote that through the development of codes for example, for impact studies, for the operating organizations, and of course, more guidance for clearance. I want to say thank you to all the listeners, and I will now